Okay. All right. So, hi everyone. Welcome to another episode of Book Cafe Podcast. In today's episode, we will be talking about this book right here behind me, entitled "The Quran and the Aramaic Gospel Traditions" by Emran El-Badawi. And I'm extremely privileged and honored to have the author himself with us for today's episode. So let's just jump right in. Professor Dr. Emran El-Badawi, welcome to Book Cafe Podcast.
Thank you so much, Omar, for having me. It's a pleasure and an honor to be with you.
Thank you so much for making the time to speak to us today. I've been a really huge fan of your work for many years now. It really is a pleasure to be able to speak to you directly. So, Professor, we'll get to talking about your book in a minute, but for our viewers and listeners who haven't actually read the book yet and who might be discovering you for the very first time, do please take this moment to tell us a little bit more about yourself. Specifically, I'm really interested to know a little bit more about your cultural background as well as your education background, where you grew up, what you do for a living, in fact, anything at all that you'd like to share with us.
Okay, Omar, that's a lot, and I'm privileged to have this platform to share my story with you and your viewers and your audience. I was born in Kuala Lumpur, Malaysia, and I am of mixed ethnic linguistic background, part Middle Eastern, part South Asian. My mother Egyptian, and even that is sort of a Middle Eastern mix. And then my late father was Malaysian of Bengali background. So that's something I can elaborate upon if you like. Being from Malaysia and many parts of Southeast Asia, it's very common to have these kind of mixed marriages. I know that here in the United States, I know you're involved in the United States. In the U.S., there's a certain sort of mixed marriage, American melting pot mentality, as though it's something newfangled and amazing. It is amazing, but it's not new, and it's been around forever. So I'm a product of a third culture that came from Malaysia and was extracted, and then we lived sort of in Saudi Arabia, Egypt, and the part of our family was in the UK, and part was in Egypt, and then the United States. And even within the US, I've been I call it the westward migration. It was, from the East Coast to the Midwest to now the Southwest, right here in Houston, Texas. What can I say about myself? Because I am ethnically, and have lived in different societies, I've had the opportunity and the burden of trying to make sense out of the world around me. I never belonged. That is the most important thing I want to communicate, is that feeling inside me as a young man, even as a young boy, that I don't belong. I'm an outsider. And many of us may have felt like this, and many of us might feel like this all the time. But this limit came for me as strength, and it allowed me to think critically, to see the way people behave from outside, themselves, because I didn't belong. And anyway, just to, I think that has shaped who I am as a person, trying to be kind to other people who are outsiders, and trying to therefore read and study the world around me with a ferocious intensity that other people around me, my peers, didn't have. So I got interested in, my number one love actually was geography. I would look at maps all day long. I wasn't so much actually into polls. I feel that was missing in my life, but I loved maps. And then it got me into culture, into religion, into society and history, all these things. I got deep into the humanities. I even dabbled with the social sciences. And I studied languages, Arabic, English, French, and I later on my graduate school in Persian, and obviously the ancient languages, Syriac, Aramaic, Greek, etc., like that. I did my undergraduate at Rutgers University in New Jersey. I did my master's in Temple University in Philadelphia, and my PhD at the University of Chicago in the Department of Near Eastern Languages and Civilizations. This book that we're talking about today, my first book, was based on my dissertation, and I have since moved to Houston, Texas, where I'm a faculty member in the Department of Modern and Classical Languages. I'm also director of Middle Eastern Studies. I'm a faculty in Arabic and Middle Eastern Studies, and a chair for all languages and all culture. I'll stop here.
Well, thank you so much for sharing that, Professor. And you can imagine my surprise when I found out that your late father was of Bengali descent from West Bengal, if I'm not mistaken, correct? From Kolkata?
Yes, sir. Yes, correct.
Okay, wonderful. So you are quite the polyglot. So I have to ask you, do you speak any Bengali at all, or no?
I I have I unfortunately don't speak Bengali. I did have the opportunity when my late father passed when I was a young boy. I remember him fondly and well, and he was an amazing example, but also a very highly cerebral and sort of towards the end a very quiet individual. He carried a lot of untold stories and I think some scars which he never had time to tell me. But he took us on trips to Calcutta. I was born. He took us on a couple of trips to Dhaka. I've been there, and I have very fond memories of Dhaka. I was a child, but I remember delicious food. I remember mines, floods, very green foliage. I remember also some riots because I remember there was the hartal that I would hear about this sort of riots that would happen.
Right. I see.
One thing about wanted to mention is so I don't typically talk about my father at all, but he he married an Arab woman in Malaysia, sort of this mixed marriage, and I think that part of that was he kept certain scars from I think this sort of post-partition India
Mhm.
that is a subject for another day, and I couldn't delve deeply enough to it because I myself was just a child when he left Bengal, West Bengal, and he got his education in the UK, and he sort of never turned back, and it left us sort of curious what's going on here. But there were some scars. Some of it had to do with family issues. There was a big patriarch in the family, and also had to do with the political situation. But I have a very soft spot in my heart for Bengali people. It's part of who I am. I take pride in it, and it's also sort of a best kept secret. How is the director of Arab studies here at Houston, of Bengali origin? But so it's just a nice story, and I'm happy to be part of the club.
Wow, amazing, amazing, and thank you so much for sharing that, Professor. Because it really is a privilege being an ethnic Bengali myself to be able to claim you as one of our own. And whatever you do, your success in Houston at the university is also our success. So kudos to you for everything that you've done so far. And I really look forward to jumping in and talking about the book. So coming to the book itself, Professor, it's entitled "The Quran and the Aramaic Gospel Traditions," and I think that it's
Yeah.
fair to say that our viewers and listeners will be very familiar with what the Quran is, the Muslim holy book. We also know that the Gospels are a part of the New Christian New Testament and was originally written in Greek. But what exactly are we referring to when we talk about the Aramaic Gospel Traditions? What body of literature is this referring to? If you could help us take us through that. Yeah.
Very good, and thank you for introducing the question appropriately, which is, I won't repeat what you just said. I will focus on just what do I mean by Aramaic gospel traditions.
Mhm.
Um, so the book, of course, compares the Arabic Quran, and we can talk about the manuscript tradition. My book goes into great detail, and we can talk about that later. But the Arabic Quran, of which there is roughly, we have the same text. People dispute with details, but it's the same A to Z picture. And then I'm comparing it with all of the translations of the four canonical gospels in Aramaic languages. So what are those translations? What are those versions? Right? There's a whole lot of literature about that, and I'm a beneficiary of that literature. So I'll mention that there are two dialects of Aramaic which demonstrate the Gospels in Aramaic language. And that's the dialect of Syriac, and the other one is Christian Palestinian Aramaic. So to briefly just introduce, I think that the audience will have to read the book to get more detail. The Syriac manuscript traditions of the Gospels is very long, and it begins with fragments in maybe the second, third century. And then you have, of course, stories of Tatianos or Tatian, who dies around 180, 190, something like that, CE. And after that, you get sort of what we call the Old Syriac Gospels. Those are preserved they were preserved in the St. Catherine's Monastery in Sinai. And those date again to roughly, I would say, 2nd to 4th century. The experts can pin it down more. And then you have very famously the Peshitta or the People's Translation. In Arabic, that would be Basita, which means simple. It's not exactly the same thing, but it's a cognate in terms of language. That, you're talking about maybe 5th century, or right around there, plus or minus. And you have an illuminated version of the Peshitta translation by Bishop Rabula, also in the 5th century. It's beautiful. It's there, it's illuminated, very colorful images from the Gospels that come to life. So that's that's the most important translation of the Gospels, the Peshitta. And then you have a Harklian version by Thomas of Harkel in the maybe early 7th century. So you have that long tradition, it's all in there. And then the Christian Palestinian Aramaic, you have fragments of just Christian texts, liturgies, prayers, gospel fragments, and they're quite late. They might be as early as 5th or 6th century. I leave it to the Gospels to argue that, but definitely by 7th or 8th century and after Islam. So that's the data that we have. That's the manuscript traditions that we have that I'm comparing. And I would say front and center is comparing the Arabic Quran, maybe the Cairo printed translation, early 20th century, with the Peshitta, whose text was standardized somewhere in the 5th century. And you put those together, that's the heart of the dialogue. There's a lot of, I'm citing all the others as well. I'm citing the Arabic translation in the 9th century of the Diatessaron, because we don't have the original anymore. So it's very complicated, and I try to do justice to it. I want to mention one thing also. The original name of the book was the Quran and the Aramaic Gospel Tradition, with no S. And actually, one of my friends and colleagues, Aaron Butts, who's now a professor of Aramaic and Semitics in the Catholic University of America, I really bowed to his ex-Aramaic, and he said, Emran, why are you calling this an Aramaic Gospel Tradition, as though it's one thing? Right. And I said, what should I call it? He goes, just add the S, traditions, because that's what it is. So I'm indebted to him for doing that. And it's just to show that there was a vibrant literary body of traditions where people were, expressing and translating and communicating the Gospels in the Aramaic. And I thought that was significant to compare with the Quran, but I'll wait for your questions to elaborate further.
Yeah. Thank you so much for that. So it's just for my knowledge, Professor, can you tell me if there's any, you've mentioned the two dialects, Christian Palestinian Aramaic and Syriac. For those of us who aren't familiar with Aramaic and the two dialects, are they mutually intelligible, or would you say that they're, or are they completely different from one another as dialects?
Very good. So, of course, let me say two things. A general remark about Aramaic. Aramaic is the language, okay, in Arabic, Al-Aramiya or Suryaniya. You find these in the Arabic text. You find it in Arabic tradition as well. The Arabs knew Aramaic as sort of their cousin language. Aramaic is a Semitic language in which the Abrahamic religions are manifested, right? So you have, the Christian Bible written in Semitic languages, and of course in Greek, right? So I don't want to get too much into it. Hebrew, Biblical Aramaic, and Targum and other dialects, and of course Koine Greek and other versions of Greek. So if we look at the Aramaic, sort of stratum of these bodies of scripture, yes, they're mutually intelligible, absolutely. So it's a Christian Palestinian Aramaic, which comes, of course, from Judea, Palestine, Galilee area, and Syriac, which comes further north from north and east, from Edessa, Nisibis, even parts of Arabia, right, in the east, are mutually intelligible. And Dennis Pardee, who's a professor of Jewish studies and ancient Near East, has made this point also, that all the Aramaic speakers, these Jews and Christians, Mandeans, pagans, same language, different dialects, because they live in different cities and they didn't have airplanes to take them places, so there's a certain provinciality to it, but they are mutually intelligible. And there are, one important thing for your audience, Arabians of Aramaic, and the Nabateans and people in other cities made Aramaic very, very popular and wrote in Aramaic, and either in inscriptions, and in the case of Hatra, Palmyra, people, are they what is their ethnicity? I don't want to get into that right now, but Aramaic was the lingua franca. It was the common language of the common man and woman in the late antique Near East. And was the most important language in Arabia before there was, the Arabic of the Quran. And it's something that we need to sort of refine and dispute. But yeah, so that's what that is.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, and it was just out of curiosity because, like in our part of the world, Hindi and Urdu are essentially the same language, and but Urdu is more Persianized and Hindi is not as much so. And so it's probably Aramaic is to Arabic what Hindi Urdu is to Bengali. Because even though and so that's just probably out of curiosity that I wanted to know, just how far apart they were because languages are always constantly mixing and there's always a lot of cross pollination and that also plays a big part in the book which we'll try and get to as well, but Imran, let's try to backtrack a little bit and talk about the origins of the book itself. What exactly inspired you to write it in the first place? You mentioned that it was what you chose for your dissertation and then it morphed into a book. Could you tell us a little bit more about that part?
Yeah, sure. Thank you. At the heart of it was, again, coming out of my own experiences of alienation and curiosity, looking at trying to understand the Quran on its own terms. So on the one hand, I was totally dissatisfied with how traditional Muslims were studying the scripture, and that's not strange. You'll find among Christians or among Jews or among Hindus, maybe they might be dissatisfied with the traditional structure. So I was one of those people, and I'm like, how can we actually understand this? And I also, in parallel, because of my curiosity, was reading the Bible and starting to learn a little bit about biblical studies, and I found really strange was the Quran is frequently making reference to Jews and Christians. It seems as though the Bible is in the background, right? This is me sort of as a young person who's uneducated, like it's somewhere there. And yet, whenever I try to consume the Bible, try to learn about it, it seems as though the ancient origins of the Bible are Greek and Latin.
Right.
And that's true, but something is missing, right? Because it's not sharing necessarily the Near Eastern milieu or the Quranic milieu, the historical context of the Quran. Now, I'll add that certainly within the past, this book was written 10 years ago. There have been obviously modifications and new discoveries, and we know now, of course, that Greek is more significant in the Arabian cultural context because just because. But still, something is missing. Like, how is it people who are so proud of their Arabic language, right? And the Quran priding itself several times as, bilisan and Arabiy and mubin, in this clear Arab tongue or clear Arabic tongue, right? That disputing, lisan ajami, this foreign tongue. Language is so important, and it's rejecting this foreign language. So how is it that the Quran is in dialogue with the Bible?
Mm-hmm.
That's how this all started. And then I started to go deeper, and I started to discover quite quickly, quite easily, actually, that, a very long tradition of, Jewish and Christian Aramaic literature, which is vibrant and recreating itself all the time in and outside of Arabia, right? So then I started to make the connection, and I said to myself, what would happen then if we have, on the eve of Islam, if the Arabians and all their neighbors, the Syrians and the Mesopotamians and the South Arabia, all these people are sort of consuming religion, and especially in the vicinity of Mecca, Medina, in Semitic languages. What would the nearest one be? It would be Aramaic.
Mm-hmm. Right.
Okay, well, then what would they be? They would be Aramaic scripture. What are they? And then I started saying, okay, well, let's take the Gospels in Aramaic and let's take the Quran in Arabic and compare them. And of course, I did the comparison. I think it yields some fascinating results. That's the feedback that I've gotten.
Right.
But that's the impulse behind it.
Right. Well. Thank you for sharing that. And if I may say so, one of the terms that you use very frequently in the book is the period of late antiquity. And once again, for our viewers and listeners who haven't read the book yet, how would you define the term late antiquity, and exactly what time period does it actually encompass?
Yes. So lately, of course, all of us who are scholars today are indebted to Peter Brown, formerly in Princeton, who sort of coined this phrase in this area of research. A delightful gentleman and a great scholar, and someone who we owe a lot to. Something, of course, that people have disputed as well. You create something that people use, and other people are like, well, it has limitations. Everything has limitations. But late antiquity is looking at that time period when Roman and by extension also the Persian empires are sort of reached this period of maturation, and they've sort of reached a critical mass, and there's nowhere left to sort of expand to. And it's a time period which is characterized by intense periods of warfare between Greeks and Persians, and also periods of peace. But it's sort of defined, or it's placed under the umbrella of this Greek and Persian dominance. So that's in general, very, very general sort of the outlines, right? So as far as historicity, maybe something as some earlier that said, the death of Marcus Aurelius, the last great Roman emperor. All of this is sort of artificial at the end, right? Or you look at Diocletian, a century, later or something like that. It's when the Romans start to crumble. It's no longer antiquity, it's now late and aging. I don't want to get so much into that, but you look at the late Roman world, you look at the Parthian and Sasanian empires, and during this time, we're talking about maybe roughly through the end of the 7th century. And in my book, I try to peg those in the sources that I'm using. So I already mentioned Tatian, who dies around 180 or 190. I don't want to make a mistake, okay? End of the 2nd century till about 714 or 705. Now, 705 is the death of the Caliph Abd al-Malik ibn Marwan, who was the Umayyad Caliph. Let me say something about him.
Please.
Why is it that my book defines late antiquity until 705 or even 714? 714 is the death of Al-Hajjaj ibn Yusuf, who's the infamous governor in Al-Iraq, who was the right-hand man of this Caliph Abd al-Malik ibn Marwan. For traditional Muslims, you're like, who are these people? Traditional Muslims know Ali, Ibn Abi Talib, or they know Abu Bakr as-Siddiq, or they know Omar ibn Khattab. Those are the names, the Sunnis and Shias are very happy about. Abd al-Malik is a very, very important, arguably early caliph in Islamic history. Why? You'll have to read up on it, right? It has been fashionable, I would say also. My mentor, Fred Donner, is, I think, the initiator of this fashion, and I take it up to a certain degree that, Abd al-Malik, of course, is he Arabizes the chancery. He makes the caliphate, the Islamic caliphate, Arabic speaking, when it was whatever, Coptic, Greek, Syriac, Pahlavi speaking, right? The Arabs were just interested in conquering and winning a very wealthy empire for themselves, not so concerned with conversion, not so concerned with anything other than just amassing power. But Abd al-Malik said, let's stop for a second and organize our empire so we can keep it. So that's why he's important, because part of his reforms included a sort of editing of the Qur'an. Right. And that incubation period, especially of, let's say, 610, which is when the tradition says that Muhammad said, okay, the Quran is now public, Islam is now, a public religion, till the death of Abd al-Malik, and really the death of Al-Hajjaj in 714. It's 100 years or so. That's how I define late antiquity.
Right. Absolutely. So if we take 180 as the starting point and 705, by the time Abdul Malik makes his appearance. So I think that's a really interesting timeline. So can you give us an idea, Professor, of what exactly you've already mentioned Persia and the Byzantine Romans. They're the two superpowers of the day. But what about the religious factional groups that were floating around? Can you give us an idea of just how sectarian and divisive this time period was, and how they were all trying to compete with each other for the souls of the faithful? Just to give us an idea of all the factions that were available at this time.
Yeah, and I can hear echoes of my book and what you're saying, right? To competing for the souls of the faithful, exactly. I can try and answer in a nutshell, and there are other studies. Again, Jack Tanous has a book on the simple believer, and there's other literature that will further inform your audience about what are the different religious groups in the late antique Near East, and maybe even Arabia. So it's complicated, and there's not one answer. But I think in the case of Arabia, if I focus on just, and especially if we look, in pre-Islamic Arabia, maybe the first century and a half, prior to Muhammad, Qur'an, you have an entire region in transition, and the Qur'an appears at the end of this transitional period. So who do you have? You have local pagan cults, right? And pagan comes from this word pagani, paganos, and of course meaning just country people. It doesn't mean idols. It doesn't mean evil. It doesn't mean bad. It just means country. It's like the Arabic word falah, or it's we have the same thing in Arabic where we just refer to skins or something like that. It's a derogatory term, I would say. But each, again, sort of these little parochial fiefdoms and nomadic and settled peoples, they worshipped a god. They might have worshipped Allah, worshipped Dusharis, Dushara or Dusaris, right? Or you had, of course, Jews and Christians, and other groups as well, Mandeans, and which are hard to categorize, Manichaeans. All of these groups, I would argue, are in Arabia. Now, what is Arabia? Again, huge discussion, debate, dialogue, right? But in its extent, it included all these groups because Arabia was relatively unconquered vis-a-vis other provinces, right? Like Syria, the different Syrias in Palestine were conquered by the Romans, or Mesopotamia, which is called Arabia, and other provinces. So I'm probably not answering your question very well right now, but it included.
You're doing just fine, Professor. Yeah, keep going.
Thank you for the boost. It included, of course, varieties of Christianity, which were not orthodox, which were heterodox, and this is something. There's a good phrase by Robert Hoyland. I think he calls it provincial creed. And but let me try to summarize this mishmash of an answer to say that the majority of the faithful within Arabia were somehow or the other monotheistic by the 6th, 7th century. What that monotheism has a lot of variety. There is syncretism. You have people, there are people who live in the world of the Jinn, of the Hebrew Bible, of the Christian Bible, of the letters of Mani, all in the same place. And that is reflected in the Quran. It comes out in the Quran that it's all hybrid and diverse in a way that is bizarre, that is almost jarring for people. Like how did this thing come together, right? And it seems seamlessly when it's sort of chanted. So
absolutely.
To say that Arabia, I'll mention something else. Sorry, one quickly. Aziz Al-Azma, he describes the Arabs as strange, therefore their history and their identity is strange. Okay, now I'll stop.
Okay, all right, cool. So, Professor, moving on to the next question. I'm really curious to know, you wrote the book back in 2014, if I'm not mistaken. And since then, we've had a lot of progress with regards to the epigraphical evidence, and especially Professor Dr. Ahmed Al-Jalad, who's been really active in this field. So I'm really curious to know what was the presence of the syncretic pagans like around the time that the Quran made its appearance. Would you say, based on today's evidence as compared to when you wrote the book, that was the presence of paganism exaggerated, do you feel, or do you feel that the traditions have got it exactly right with regards to their presence in Arabia at the time?
Okay, so this is like two big questions to do one at a time.
Sure.
The first one, if I recall correctly, so let me talk about epigraphy for a little bit. So in my book, again, this is 10 years ago. The book actually was published in 2013. The imprint is. There was not yet this revolution in Arabian epigraphy, but there was already enough of a clue with the handful of what we called pre-Islamic Arabic, or even Paleo-Arabic inscriptions, maybe 5 or 10. To demonstrate that these people are either card-carrying Christians or very close to that. They're monotheistic, and there are crosses on these. That was already, that's the news. And you mentioned Ahmed Al-Jalad, also Leila Nama and Christian Robin. I'm indebted to we're all indebted to them, right? They keep digging up new stuff out of the rocks. And I will say that what they are discovering are more monotheistic inscriptions on the eve of Islam. It confirms what all of us, not just me, what Gabriel, Reynolds, and colleagues have been saying, that the Arabs are monotheistic. There are lots of Jews and Christians who compose the bedrock of what will later on be this group, this body of the Muslim body politic of the body. So that's how I take it. I'm very, very thrilled and excited that they're finding more evidence to confirm and refine
Mm.
The corrections that they make are refining our theories and it is not in any way a contradiction or moving a different. No, we're going more and more in the same direction. So now I get to your second point. Islamic tradition, beginning with Ibn Ishaq or Abu Mikhnaf or the others, Muqatil ibn Sulaiman, these famous names that we know. The first Sira or the first Terry, Muqatil Mujahid. Some of these names whose book is actually they're of doubtful provenance. These books are written like at least 150 years after the fact. And again, Aziz Al-Azam has been the most charitable, saying, oh, well, the gap is maybe less than a century. Maybe. We're talking about that point about 70 or 80 years. That's still a long time. It's not documentary evidence. And at its maximum extent, you're talking about 200-300. So you have a large gap. This is the sources problem, and I'm not going to get into it now. There again, Fred Donner's talked about this at length. John Wansbrough took it to one extreme, right? And then you might describe Aziz Al-Azam and others on the other side of the spectrum. Right. But there, in my opinion, I try to walk a middle path. But the Islamic tradition is written for an audience that wants to learn and wants to inculcate its Islamic identity, right? It's written for Muslim audience to teach them identity is about, and that Arabic language is part of the Muslim identity, and that Islamic law is part of the Muslim identity. And so that's the picture. Islamic tradition is not there to document the origins of Islam or tell its history and according to the tools of text, historical criticism. That's something to keep in mind. Why? Because we have to respect the Islamic tradition because it's so incredibly erudite and informative, and it is. But in the process of creating an identity, they did, of course, have to create an other, like a straw man almost, which is the sort of Jahiliyyah. And what is the Jahiliyyah? The Jahiliyyah is cited 3 or 4 times in the Qur'an, and it in my most recent book, Queens and Prophets, subject for another day, maybe another show. But
don't worry, we'll get to that right at the end.
No worries. It's the Jahiliyyah is not a historical reconstruction of pre-Islamic Arabia or late antique Arabia. It is the darkness before the light of Islam, which is what we, the traditional Muslim, should learn in order to entrench sort of this deep identity of deep Islamic identity. So all this is to say what? It's to say that Arabia was already centuries prior to Islam in a period of transitioning away from paganism towards monotheism. You find this in the epigraphic record, and you find it also in the literary record when you look at the works of Epiphanius, Sozum, and these people who are writing mainly in Greek. They're writing, of course, heresiographies, and they're talking about the Arabs being sort of, bad monotheists. They have the Coloridians, the Arabici. They were also, before the Monophysite church, or what would later on become celebrated as the Jacobite church, the Arabs were big proponents of this, the one nature of Christ. So the Arabs are very, very involved, and the Ghassanids, for example, saved the Monophysite church. That's something I mentioned in the recent book. A couple of other things. Philip Wood describes the Syriac landscape of these monks and ascetics as a kind of Wild West. And Arabia is certainly part of that Wild West as well. And because everything's happening all at once. Then to this point, what we get from the Islamic tradition about the Jahiliyyah is a monochromatic, post-fact, a reconstruction of a straw man. It's almost entirely Vedic, and there are nuggets of history and truth in there, but that's what's going on.
Absolutely. And I think that you've put it really aptly, Professor, by calling it a straw man, because now I always treasure any book that teaches me something new. And I honestly have to say that before picking up this particular book, I never really thought too much about the Jahiliyyah period, quote unquote. And it seems like that period wasn't people weren't as ignorant as the traditions would make us believe. So yeah, thank you so much for putting it so nicely. And straw man is probably the best way to describe this particular time period. So, Professor, just diving back into that particular milieu, let's come to the person of the Prophet Muhammad himself. Another scholar that you name dropped a couple of times in the book is, of course, Sidney Griffith, the very renowned biblical Quranic scholar, and he mentioned in his book that the itinerant businessmen, which would include somebody like the Prophet, would frequently go up to Syria, and because the church liturgies at the time were given in the Aramaic language, which was the lingua franca, and because perhaps they weren't completely bilingual, so they had to kind of rely on their business partners who were fluent in Syriac to give them spot translations back into Arabic. Would you agree with Sidney Griffith on this particular point, that there was a lot of itinerant businessmen that were getting these ideas from the Syriac churches, but they were having spot translations done for them by their Syriac business partners? So what would be your answer on that?
Okay, so the one-word answer is possibly. And the 1,000-word answer will follow, which is basically that, again, Sidney Griffith is a towering figure on Christian Arabic and, and Syriac as well. And his book on the Church in the Shadow of the Mosque is really quite extraordinary. His book, the book is a masterpiece. That said, of course, there is, I think, some limitation to imagining that Muhammad, who is the prophet and the founder of this, becomes global. How he intended it, we have to ask and debate. But there's some debate about who he is and how is it that his life can somehow be gelled or integrated into this Quranic dialogue with Syriac. How are these two things coming together? So the problem, I think, and I'm probably part of the problem, right? I mentioned itinerant businessmen, of course, in my book. I think that's defensible for a reason that I'll mention in a second. But I think that the problem with that idea is it lends itself to the traditional Islamic notion of sirah, or that Muhammad as a young boy under his uncle Abu Talib, and then later on as a grown man under Khadija, travels. And I think he does travel quite a lot, actually. He probably lived quite a while in different places, but we don't know. We have to speculate. So this is pure speculation. And Griffith speculates, I speculate, and others do as well. The problem with this, of course, is that it seems to look for an agent outside the sort of locus of creation that will sort of translate Syriac for you. And there's of course a story within the Hadith that Zayd ibn Thabit, one of the who would be a late committee that gives us the Quran that we have today, but he's one of the famous Sahaba that Muhammad the Prophet comes to him and says, "Hey Zayd, I don't like how the Jews are talking to each other." This is part, by the way, of a category of literature, adversus Judaeus. It's an anti-Judaic way of speaking made popular by Christians, but because that's in the background of the Quran and Islam, it gets inherited as well. Anyway, so it's a sort of a trope. The Jews are talking to this language because they're bilingual, which I think we should assume. All people are bilingual. We assume that they're monolingual, which is totally irregular. It's an aberration, actually. So he says, Zayd, you're gifted with languages. Go what they're saying. Go find out. So he goes and researches the languages, their language, and he learns Syriac, As-Suryaniya, right? Okay, or I'm sorry, I think it calls it Al-Ibraniya. They call it Hebrew, referring typically to Jewish Aramaic or Jewish stuff. And then he learned it in 2 weeks, and then there you go. Muhammad now has some sort of communication with these monotheists through their language. It may or may not be true. It seems a little bit convenient, if you ask me. And what I mentioned is to pivot away a little bit from Griffith's notion that, Muhammad's going, yes, Muhammad, Khadija, and all these people that they have, there's a connection with Greater Syria and with Syriac and Armenia and even with the south of Yemen. But we should pivot away from there, because even in this book and in my most recent book and with the discoveries that are made, you're learning just how Christian Arabia itself was. And we even have now, a Syriac inscription discovered within the past, just a few years. I think it's Christian Robin who published it, from Hema, Najran area, a very famous Christian area, which has some sort of some devotional text. It's Syriac. It's in Arabia. That's right. It's a hop, skip, and jump from Mecca.
Right. Absolutely. Yeah, and I think that's really.
Sorry, I had some technical issues.
Yeah, no worries. Yeah,
I'm sorry. I had one. I wanted to add one more thing. I'm sorry, I had a technical issue here.
Sure.
So just to add to this point, So rather than thinking about how the Arabian context was getting something to outside, we have to internalize that the inside itself was very Christianized and Aramaicized, along with its Arabic context. One last thing I'll mention is there's a great book by Jean-Nicole Milon, Saint Laurent is her last name, right? It's on Syriac missionary stories, and she does a great job of emphasizing that Syriac missionaries are sort of part of the picture, but then who are you missionizing to? It's these barbarians who are frequently, Arabs and other pagan populations. And there's a long tradition of, Syriac bishops, Ahudeme, George, Bishop of the Arabs, others, I'm forgetting, Simeon the Stylite. They're all converting the Arabs en masse, right? And the Arabs are becoming Christian. And this is centuries before Islam. And that happens over a network. And Muhammad is part of that network. He lives in the network, right? It's almost like I feel like I'm talking about the Matrix now. So rather than thinking about, is it Damascus? No, he's living in on these trade caravans and the traffic between. So I'll stop now.
Yeah, absolutely. And thank you for summarizing that, because and you mentioned just how important the presence of Christians were at the time. And I have to confess that before reading your book, I didn't actually appreciate just how much of an influence the different various Christian factions had on the Prophet's message and the way he was trying to articulate it to his own audience. So, Professor, if I can just backtrack just a little bit with regards to your book and another book that I read just after this one was The Jesus Wars by Peter Jenkins, which you've also name dropped in your book. And for our viewers and listeners who may not be as familiar with how divisive this time period was, can you help? Let me just try to rudimentarily state what the different belief systems were. So you have the Monophysites, the Diophysites, and the Monophysites. All three of them had a belief that Jesus had either one divine nature, two divine natures, or two natures unified into one. Do you find it surprising that the Quran picked the one nature that wasn't present with the other three groups, which is that he had only one human nature, and so that was like the only one left, and so that's the one that it went with. Would you say that this was kind of like a compromise with regards to the other groups that were available at the time?
Yeah, there is a lot of research being done now. I came recently from I've come recently this past 6 months from conferences in Palermo, Sicily, Tübingen, Germany, and other places, where so many amazing, outstanding colleagues are doing work on really deep theological work on the Quran and how it meshes with the different, Christological controversies. I wish, they're at this point, given their cutting edge research, I hesitate to respond with any sort of confidence. Of course, I've made my case in the book, and I'm not taking too much of a position that, the Quran's theology aligns more with this or that. I think that there's a certain maybe default position to the Monophysite, right, or the Jacobite church, and how widespread, and especially with Jacob of Sarug, who was Monophysite but tried to reconcile everyone together. So it's complicated. It's actually really, really complicated. The Quran is trying to do a similar thing where it's sort of like, Jesus has this human nature only, and it says this one nature, but it's one nature that's different than the other one nature church. But I would say now, especially, if I can update some of what I said earlier, there is, of course, Nestor Cavadas, who's in Germany. He's worked on this, and there's the Diaphysite Church, the Chalcedonians and the non-Chalcedonians. They're all relevant to the way the Quran is formulating its Christology and theology. One example of this, of course, Al-Ma'idah, Surah 5, when I've brought this up many times to my colleagues, when God, judges Jesus on the last day and says, "Did you tell the people to take you and your mother as gods instead of me?" Someone asked me that, if God asked me that question, I would look at him, I would quiver and I would say no. But he doesn't do that. That's bizarre. That is outlandish in this text, which is unbridled, strict mono. Why would you not say no to God? The reason is because the Quran is weaving between all the different theological, Christological positions that now our colleagues are researching. So I'll answer. Of course, I've mentioned, and you've made reference also to the different groups. There's so many groups within the Quran. I'm, believers, Muslims, and I'm reading from your text, your assemblies who have splintered, Jewish groups, Christians, people of the Gospels, people of Scripture, Sabaeans, Magians, Puritans, associators, hypocrites, rebels. There's not just one block, and there's a reason for that. And if we look, that a lot of this happens in the shadow of Justinian the Great. Of course, is the caliph of the Christians before there's Islam. He tries to standardize and bring together the church, and in the process really rubs the Monophysites in Syria, Egypt, and throughout Arabia. He rubs them the wrong way. He persecutes them, he pummels them, he fights with them. And I do see the Quran as being sort of part of this counter, and again in the shadow, this longue durée of 100 years, fighting back against empire, fighting back against clergy, fighting back against the Byzantines, while being pro-Roman at the same time. So it's complicated. And again, this Holden has been working on this as well. So there's a lot of great research coming out.
Wow, fantastic. Well, that's this is one of the one of the things I really love about this field of study is that there's always something new that's coming up, and we're able to recalibrate and change our opinions, as we go forward. I think that one of the reasons I actually was curious to get your take on the Quran's position on Jesus was because I think you started the book by saying that Islam can best be understood as a response to the different factions that were within the church. And so rather than pick any one of the three existing positions, this might be the only position that's left for the Quran to take by default. But yeah, thank you so much for giving your take on that. I think that's really interesting. We'll keep an open mind with regards to what comes up. Okay, so Professor, moving on to the next question. There's one other phrase that you use very frequently in the book, in addition to late antiquity, and that is dogmatic re-articulation. So I really love this particular phrase because, as you mentioned, that the Quran is in dialogue with the Syriac scriptures. And so the Quran is essentially taking from the Syriac scriptures and presenting its own opinion. But if I were to ask you, is dogmatic re-articulation just a very polite way of saying polemics, or would you say that no, there is a difference between trying to be polemical and trying to actually re-articulate what the message of the Syriac Gospels are? What would be your take on that?
Okay, I'll try to answer briefly. Dogmatic re-articulation is the methodology for how I understand the Quran retelling these passages in the Gospels, and probably passages in general. There are other ways to look at it. So there are two, which does not refer to the Catholic Church or to institution. That's not how I use it. And I know that I got some resistance from my colleagues, but it has to do with sort of assertion and power. And then, of course, articulation has to do with eloquent speech. So you put them together, you get dogmatic re-articulation, because I was somewhat inspired by, I think it's in Surat Al-Furqan, is it chapter 25? Sure, 24, 25, one of those. So there's, of course, the passage in there which says, وَمَا جِئْنَاكَ, we don't come to you with, so it's like, there's, the Quran always makes reference to stuff that exists in the past. And it doesn't, so the speaker doesn't come to the messenger, presumably Muhammad, right? إِلَّا جِئْنَاكَ بِالْحَقِّ وَأَحْسَنَ تَأْوِيلًا. Right? So we don't come to you with anything except that it is the truth with a capital, and أَحْسَنَ تَأْوِيلًا, and sort of better speech, better articulation. That's how I was inspired by it. So the Quran is not just rehashing, repeating, retelling in any sort of way, which is why the early Oriental, this is fake, it's fake scripture, because of course they were missionaries themselves, and they were being polemical in their regard. And if I can cite, for example, the most respectable, I think, among them was Abraham Geiger and his, formidable work, which sort of gave birth to Quran studies in the West and certainly in Germany, was the Quran is sort of derivative, and it's categorically false. And what I mean to say here is that what the Quran is doing is that it partly polemical with the Bible, with the version of the Bible, because it sees that there's a sort of lost version which has been corrupted, but also to bring to light that the Quran is nuanced, it's refined, it's careful, it's methodical in how it retells stories from the Bible or even from post-biblical tradition.
No, okay, absolutely. Well, that's really nicely said, Professor, and I thank you for that because it was something that was on my mind while reading the book, and I think you've answered it really well. Well, Emran, I have to say that I've pretty much exhausted all of my questions for the show, but there is one more thing that I wanted to tell you, which is that before we started, I did solicit some questions from other people to send in their questions for the show, just so we could get a bit diverse, some diversity with regards to the questions. And so the first guest question that we have is actually from somebody that you know very well. And he, in fact, is actually a very close friend and mentor, is how you've described him. And he's none other than Professor Dr. Gabriel Said Reynolds from the University of Notre Dame, who is also the author of the book Allah, God in the Quran, and he's also a friend of the show. So, with your permission, I would like to give you the question that he gave me before we started. And the question is, Dear Emran, since you published your book, Fred Donner has published Muhammad and the Believers. What are your thoughts on his idea of the ecumenical nature of the earliest believers community? Could Christians have followed Muhammad without leaving their faith, despite the anti-Christian rhetoric in the Quran? So yeah, that's the question from Gabriel Said Reynolds, and I think it's a wonderful question. And you've of course talked about Fred Donner in the beginning, as well as his book Muhammad and the Believers. So yes, do please go ahead. What would be your take on that question?
Yeah, thank you. I thank, of course, Gabriel, my friend, colleague, and mentor, for the question. I have vacillated on the answer myself. I know that he and others may be a little bit more, careful about this idea. But I will say that I do accept that, that within the history and within the incubation period of the Quran, there is a time when Jews and Christians are included. Is that incubation period, can that be extended till the late 7th century, which is when when Fred Donner is making this argument that this happens? Maybe, I would say maybe, and because we don't know. And prior to Abdul Malik, is it possible? I think it is possible, and for the reasons that I've mentioned already, that the majority of the populace, Jews and Christians. So I think that it would make sense, and I think that Fred argues this better, right? That they would be even, large parts of the ummah, the community, would be in fact Jews and Christians. I'm trying to I accept that happened, but I'm not exactly sure where in history, where does the shift take place? Abdul Malik, maybe prior, not sure.
Okay. Well put. Well, I want to believe that it was ecumenical because I do subscribe to a pluralistic worldview. And if you'd asked me 20 years back, when my knowledge was a lot less and zeal was a lot more, I might have probably gone the other way. But yeah, the more I read your books and everybody else who's in this field of study, I do probably side more with Dr. Fred Donner and what he's written. So, Professor, there is actually one more question that I have for you, and that is with, again, somebody whom you know very well. And he is also a friend of the show, and he is Barrister Yasser Latif Hamdani. And you were very gracious in sending him a question for his episode, so he wanted to do likewise. But he tried topping you by actually sending in a video of his questions. So I would like to just screen share with you and see if I can get this question up. 1 second. Okay, here we go.
Assalamu alaikum, Imran. It's such a pleasure to connect with you here, and I thank Omar for giving us this opportunity. My question is related to this book I read back when we were at Rutledge. It's called Hagerism or Hagerism. It was by Patricia Crone and Cook. And I
I
was
can't
just
hear the
wondering
audio.
what you think of as, I believe that your book also addresses the same issue. What do you think of this theory that Islam was another Jewish movement, a Jewish messianism movement? What do you make of this theory? I've always found this book to be very fascinating, and I'm really looking forward to reading your book and seeing what you say about this.
Okay, so Professor, I think you might have had some trouble with the audio, so I'm just going to read out the question to you verbatim. So Yasser Latif Hamdani says, Assalamu alaikum, Imran. It's such a pleasure to connect with you here, and I thank Omar for giving us this opportunity to do so. My question is related to this book I read back when we were at Rutgers University. The book is called Hagerism by Patricia Crona and Michael Cook. I wanted to get your thoughts on the book, specifically with regards to what you make of the theory that Islam was another Jewish messianic movement. I have always found this book to be very fascinating, and I'm really looking forward to reading your book as well.
Well, thanks to you, and of course, thanks of course to my old friend Yasser Latif Hamdani, advocate Hamdani, has become a very successful, really prominent figure, and very grateful to get this question. So, I mean, to try and answer it, and he read the book before I did. I read it in grad school. He read it in undergrad. This is amazing. So he's tremendously intellectual and highly intelligent. Ferocious. So that's to his credit. The theory, I mean, Hagerism is sort of was a game changer a long time ago, and it made waves. And Patricia Crone, who passed away in 2016, remains a towering figure. The theory itself, as informative, it was a great exercise. Has, I think, at this point been, refuted. Most prominently, I would say, by Fred Donner, who, if we had more time, and we don't, there's a spectrum of when scholars think Islam as a religion, or the Qur'an as a book, where they're separate things, how when those things sort of materialized. Some people think it's early, some people think it's middle, some people think it's and of course the Wansbrough school, the Crone Cook school, in the past made the argument that this period of crystallization was very late, that it was 8th, 9th century in Mesopotamia or in Transjordan, Palestine area. There are arguments for that, but it's not, I would say, a minority position. It's not one that I accept. It's one that in a recent book by Stephen Shoemaker, he sort of revived, sort of truncated version. And it's one that, again, Fred Donner refutes, but, Donner is willing to extend the period, the incubation or crystallization period, a little bit longer, to maybe the middle or late 7th century. I think that the crystallization of Islam and of the Quran is in the early 7th century. It is precisely when the tradition says it is, but not in the ways that it says. And I think that the archaeological record, and again the literary record, is reinforcing the majority position. This minority position, of course, is something that Crone she walked back and cooked to some degree, but he can speak for himself. He's still with us today. But again, it was a fascinating book, and she's contributed a lot to the study. And I thank again Yasser for his question.
Oh, absolutely. Well, I really would have loved to have seen Dr. Patricia Crone and Dr. Fred Donner, have a debate about this, and have it recorded. But it's just very unfortunate that she's no longer with us. But I do find it to be a very interesting question, and really thankful to Barrister Yasser Latif Hamdani for sending in that question. Okay, so Professor, we're almost right at the cusp of ending this particular episode. But before we let you go, we do have one or two staple questions that we have on the show. So I'll just ask you one of those questions. And we are, after all, a podcast about books. So the question to you is, if you could select a book that you feel that every, let's say, young person should read, at least once in their lifetime. It may or may not be related to your particular field of, your particular field. What would be that one particular book that you would select, which you feel that everybody in the world should read at least once in their lifetime?
Yeah, thanks for the question. And this is hard. It's hard. I actually did not really grow up reading. I wasn't a big reader, to be honest. I was very curious about things, and I read a lot of nonfiction, as I mentioned. So I was looking at maps, collecting maps, and even I could, collectibles and doing weird, nerdy stuff like that, instead of reading, Mary Poppins and other Arabic novels. But if to try and answer quickly, Of course, I do read, and Stephen Hawking has this book, Ruminations on looking at the universe, and there are other books that I find interesting. I enjoy books that tend to be comprehensive and look at the world, that look at humanity. I would recommend this book is, of course, Khalil Gibran's The Prophet. Just a fascinating book. It's a small book like this.
Yep.
And Khalil Gibran himself is, within a minute, he is a Lebanese Christian peasant whose Maronite faith came out in like this Sufi form. And I remember reading it first. I'm like, oh, this guy's got to be some sort of Sufi Muslim. And of course, he comes from this Christian background where he's building bridges. I saw a lot of similarities. I wanted to be like him. He came from the Middle East, and he settled in the West. And he wrote this book, and it's now when you can buy bilingual, English, Arabic, it's a book about how to be a human being. And he himself was an artist. I have in my office right here. If you were, one day I would love to have you in my office and show you. I have these large books with these drawings by Khalil. So that's what I would share with your audience.
Absolutely. Well, thank you so much for that. And that's a book that my wife and I really love. In fact, we have multiple copies of that particular book. I think I might have bought it, and then she went and bought it. And I was like, wait, why'd you buy it without telling me? Because we already have a copy at home. But yeah, it's one of those generational things that gets passed on. My parents also loved it a lot. And yeah, thank you so much for that. I think that The Prophet by Khalil Gibran is really an excellent book. And I really do hope that anybody else who is watching or listening to this podcast hasn't read it yet, just goes out and buys it immediately. Okay, so Professor, we've pretty much come to the end of it, but just before we let you go, one more question. Can you tell us about any upcoming books that you have in the pipeline? In fact, you do have several that are already out that was written after the Quran and the Aramaic Gospel Traditions came out. So would you put in a plug for that so that our viewers and listeners can go and get to know about it?
Yes, of course. Every professor is very happy to promote their own work, giving me an opportunity. I have, of course, in 2019, Communities of the Quran, which looks at it's a modern appreciation for how the Quran has shaped the world today. You can take a look at that. In 2022, so just recently, I published Queens and Prophets, which looks at how Arabian women and the holy men that worked for them shaped the well, and you can check it out. Two of the stars there, of course, are Khadija and Muhammad, we mentioned earlier. And then now I have two manuscripts. One is Female Divinity in the Quran, which again, it's part of my turn. I'm looking, because for me, I'm not starting on a gender studies or feminist footing. I'm a student of all these amazing scholars, including Layla Ahmad, Keisha Ali. I'm cowering before them. But because of the unexplored territory, female divinity in the Quran is one thing that I want to explore and share. And the other one is female power in Arabia, late antique Arabia, looking at how attributes of female agency, debating issues of matrilineality, marriage, and things like that. Looking, and it's in dialogue with Arabs are converting to monotheism and how it comes out in the Quran. So it's a little bit of a wild, set of projects, and I'm sort of finding my way, bumping up against all sorts of things, and my colleagues are helping me.
Absolutely. Well, thank you so much for letting us know about that, and I'm really looking forward to reading both those books. It's not available yet in Bangladesh, but I will probably get my brother to send it over because he's a Californian resident. So let's see, we'll try and get those books once I'm done reading. I'll definitely would love to have you back for a future episode to talk about those two books. So once again, for our viewers and listeners who have been watching all this time, thank you for being with us. The book, once again, is The Quran and the Aramaic Gospel Traditions by Professor Dr. Emran El-Badawi. It's a fantastic book written by a really fantastic author, so please go out and buy it. And also be sure to look out for his other books, Communities in the Quran, as well as Queens and Prophets. So I'm sure those two will also be really fabulous reads. So, Professor, once again, thank you so much for your time. It's really been a pleasure talking to you. I've really learned a lot, and I hope that anybody who's watching and listening to this podcast has also benefited, and I hope that it's been really edifying and knowledgeable. We'll let you go now, and we do really hope to have you back for a future episode, like I said. And we do invite you back to Dhaka if ever you want to come back for a visit. We'd love to have you.
Thank you so much, Omar. It's an honor and a pleasure. You're a gifted interviewer. You're incredibly erudite, and your reading has brought this great podcast to fruition. Please continue your great work. Anytime you need my books, just send me an address, and I'll send you a free copy. Don't buy my books, okay? That's just for you only. All right.
Thank you. That's really generous of you. All right. Thank you so much, Professor. So you have a good day and happy Ramadan Mubarak.